So this is a joint paper with two of my colleagues or ex-colleagues, or Italian ones. And so the basic topic here, what I'm interested in this paper, are mixed marriages. Okay? So in many developed countries, there's been a rise of mixed marriages. By mixed marriages, I mean natives marrying foreigners. Okay? And this is a combination of several factors. One, there's just more migrants around, especially these days. I mean, it's a big topic policy-wise, for better and for worse. And there's also been changing norms, and also the economic circumstances of these migrants make them perhaps more desirable. And the native population maybe have changed its views on foreigners as well. Okay. I'm looking here at Western countries. Western countries in general. Well, that's a general statement. I will zoom in into Italy as at the forefront of modern economies. So why do we care about interethnic or mixed marriages? Well, essentially, if you read or open up the sociology literature, this is often seen as a sign of integration of minorities. Okay? So this is seen as a desirable thing. Okay? So actually the paper will build also on John's paper because I learned about this, what was this, NOF, National Origin Formulation. Okay, that's actually, because if you want to design a policy, well, you have to understand the role of different drivers. So why do natives marry foreigners, and why do foreigners marry natives? Okay? It's not that I'm necessarily advocating this kind of policies, but if you want to do that, you have to understand why this is happening. So I can see at least three different factors here. One is cultural distance in marriage decisions. It's probably easier to make a marriage between people of the same culture work in general. Actually, mixed marriages are a bit less stable than homogeneous marriages. There's also a bunch of economic factors influencing marriages, so work opportunities and so on. And one thing which has not been really stated in the literature so far are legal factors, essentially the role of labor market access. Okay? So in many countries, if you're a foreigner, it's difficult actually to get legal access to your country. And one quick way to get access is to marry a native. Okay? And that gives incentives to foreigners to mix with the natives. So in general, and as much as Andrew's paper, what I'm trying to understand here is how do spouses trade off different traits. Okay? So people differ in many characteristics, their nationality and culture, but also age, education, and so on. Okay? Now, it is difficult to disentangle the importance of each of those components because there's not much experimental variation. Usually, and I'm not talking exactly about Andrew's paper here, but more on the static literature on marriages at Chiappori, for instance, is essentially very observational type of identification. It's coming out of a cross-section. Okay? Why is that important in my context? Well, legal factors and the fact that you cannot work here is very much linked to your culture and your country of origin. Okay? So there will be very little variation, if any, if you're just looking at a cross-section. Okay? So what I'm going to use here, I'm going to look at particular episodes in the European Union, in which countries from former Soviet bloc accessed into the EU. Okay? While they were doing that, the citizens of those countries actually got at the same time the right to travel and to work in any of the EU countries. Okay? And that gave them, that was great for them. The corollary of that is that they didn't need to marry any citizens of the EU anymore. Okay? So that's maybe welfare improving for them, because they get both legal access to work and they have a broader choice of mates. Okay? What I'm going to argue at some point is that that was kind of a transfer of welfare from away from the natives, and a special category of natives who tended to marry those women. Okay? Sorry?
So you're not going to
I'm going to talk about that. Yeah. Yeah.
They probably, now that they are in the EU, they probably can live in other European countries and meet these other people, other ethnic people.
Yeah.
And they choose to marry them.
So we'll see. So this is going to be about Italy. Italy marriage markets are extremely local. Okay. I'll talk about that later as well. So what we're going to do here is going to exploit admin data on, so we got the universe of marriage certificates in Italy between 1998 and 2012, and separations or divorces, if you want, for short, on the same period. Okay. So we...
If it's, what you want to exploit or explain ethnic marriage,
Yeah.
then there is one group that is moving in, right?
Sure.
It's not local.
No, but many of those were already there. So I'm going to, you'll see it's essentially going to be a different diff identification strategy. And so some of the foreigners had their situation changing, okay, and not the others. I'll be more specific on the politics of that. Okay?
Sure.
Yes. Paul.
You say that it's not worth. First of all, you had to marry the EU president before, now you don't have to. So when you go to the data, is it worth looking at people who used to come in, still come in,
Sure.
but don't marry anybody? It doesn't seem like.
Yeah. Essentially, that's what I'm going to do.
You're only looking at marriages and separations, not immigrations without marriage.
No. No, so I don't have, yeah. Okay. So the first part of the talk actually is going to be a very reduced form. Okay, so just different. It's not that I've gone to the dark forces. I do models as well, and the model will come later. But you'll see that the variation in data is so stark and so precise that just looking at the graphs gives you a very good idea of what's going on and what's. But I develop a model later. Actually, it's here. And the models will be a bit different from Andrew's model, very different. Essentially, it's an equilibrium marriage. It's going to be a static model, or mostly static. And it's going to be an equilibrium model of marriages, and where we have these trade-offs. Okay, more in the tradition of the Chiapari kind of literature than the directed search in equilibrium models. So the plan of the talk, so I'll talk to you a bit about the background, because you need to talk a bit about the particularities of this transition, and I'll show you some graphs here, and then we go into the model. Okay, so what is that about? Yeah, so Italy has a very restrictive migration policy officially. You can come to Italy as an illegal migrant, but if you want to have the right to work or work legally, it's actually quite difficult. Okay? So it takes a very long time to acquire the Italian citizenship, okay? At least 10 years or so. Okay? 10 years, and your children would not necessarily have Italian citizenship even if they're born there. Okay? Now, the fast track is to find a native and marry that native, and that gives you almost immediate access, or give you immediate access to residency and regular work in Italy. Okay, so that's the way to go. And also it gives you a fast track to Italian citizenship while you're married. Okay. So to give you a background on Italian migration, so Italy didn't have migrants before the 90s. I mean, Italy was sending away its citizens abroad. But so it's a very recent phenomenon, but it's grown extraordinarily rapidly in the last 10, 15 years or so. They come a bit from all over the world, Asia, Africa, and mostly also other parts of Europe. Okay. If you zoom in onto the European migrants, so most of them are actually coming from one particular country, which is Romania. Okay. And migrants like me from France or the traditional Europe hasn't changed that much. Okay. So the big influx is Romania, and then other former countries from the Soviet bloc, Poland and Bulgaria and so on. Okay. So it's huge influx, even before these countries actually were part of the EU. Okay. Now, if you look...
This is migration into...
Yeah, into Italy. That's the stock, like a stock of foreigners, married or not married.
Is there differential by city, by...
Oh yeah, there's, sure. Sure, because so as you can see here, I mean, they come from different origins. So right now, there's a lot of people from Africa coming through the south of Italy, and that's in the press. The Romanians come from a bit from above. So there's a lot of differences across areas in Italy. Italy is a very local economy, so each town is very particular. Okay? And they're very proud of that. Okay, if you look at the migration rate between men and women, it's actually substantially similar. So it's not a migration which is unbalanced in terms of sexes, so you get men and women at the same time. Now, if I superimpose this graph with marriages, this is marriage rates over the period, the 90s to 2013, you can see that as more migrants came into Italy, there was also more mixed marriages. So this is with the man being Italian and the wife being foreign, and the wife being Italian and the man foreign. Okay? So you can see two things in the graph. First, Italian men are much more likely to marry foreign women. Okay? So it seems to be an asymmetry in terms of the choice or the access to foreign culture or the value of foreign culture. And the second thing is that somewhere between 2004 and 2007, the marriage rates kind of stalled. And they were increasing as there were more and more foreigners, and then they stalled. Okay? Although there was more and more foreigners within Italy. Okay? So something happened there. Okay? So what could that be? Well, this is a map of Europe. Okay, we're here. With a different accession of countries. Okay, so we have the old Europe here in kind of darker shade. In 2004, this bunch of countries, including Poland, the Baltic countries, and some countries I have a hard time to remember, over here. And in 2007, you have Bulgaria and Romania entering. Okay, so first these, and then these two countries. Okay. The timing is important. So there was a decision in 2002 to admit this first wave of countries, which is Poland and the other ones here. And 2 years later, they officially were part of the EU, okay? At which point their citizens had legal access to any EU country. Not just, well, any is a bit of an overstatement because some countries put some barriers to mobility and legal work, but not Italy, okay? Or very little so. 2007 is when Bulgaria and Romania entered the EU, and this was known essentially 2 years before, so in 2005. So, okay, I'm skipping this slide because, sure, okay. So just to talk a bit about the data, so we have administrative data, that's about 3 to 4 million observations at individual level. So this is marriage certificate, and so you get the information which is on marriage certificate, okay, which is the age of the spouses, the country where they're born in, their education, and where they reside in terms of provinces in Italy, okay? So you don't get that much more. So there's way more things you would like to know, but it's a bit limited as of information. But at least the interesting part is that you have the exact date of marriage, which is not necessarily the case in other data sets. We get also data on singles, and that's coming from the census at various intervals, and we're going to extrapolate in between. And then there's also there's also some irregular migrants in Italy, and we're going to count them or use some data that counts them. Okay. And I'll be short on that. Somewhere here, I should say that we matched divorces or separations to marriages. So we can follow given marriages over time. So let's look first at the boring slide. So you have time here in years and the marriage rate here. And so the blue one is the marriage rate of Italians marrying Italians. So this is homogamous marriages. Okay? The point of the graph is to show you that there's not much going on during that time. Okay? Apart from the fact that marriage rates declined in Italy, as in many developed countries, so people were marrying less. Partly because education, there's people staying longer in education and choose to marry later. Same thing for Italians marrying European nationals of the old Europe, so France, Germany, and so on. Okay, so that's the backdrop of what was happening in Italy at that point. Now, if I superimpose here the marriage rates of essentially the, in red here, these are the Poles, so those who entered in 2004. So what you could see is that before that, they were falsely increasing. Okay, so we normalized the marriage rate in 98 to 1. Okay, so instead of decreasing, those marriages on increase in the years before, and they were like 50% higher over that period from here to here. Okay? So you can't see on this graph here, but this should be shaded. From here, this is 2004, and that's when these citizens or these people learn that their country is about to enter the EU, and so that very soon they can actually work legally. What happened then was that this marriage unraveled, so the marriage rate went down over that period. Okay? Now, what was happening here in marriages with Romanians, so these are Italian men with Romanian wives, these were increasing even faster. Okay? And while the Poles or the women from Poland essentially were not so interested in Italian men turned even faster to Romanian women. Okay? That was a bit unfortunate because, well, 2 years later, they were about to learn that Romania was about to enter the EU, and this marriage just fell down a cliff. Okay? So I found that a kind of interesting experiment on the side of the natives. Obviously, the first choice or so in terms of numbers were this kind of the Poles here and Romanians. But so this is an experiment where you decline the men, the best choice or the preferred choices. Okay? And then you can see where they turn to whom they turn to. In that case, you can see that they turn here more towards Romanian, which is a country which has some ties with Italy. They share a similar type of language. And then you can see, you deny them not only the first, but also the second choice, and you see where they re-optimize. Okay? What happened afterwards was a bit more complicated because there were many nationalities they turned to. So what became more popular were kind of more exotic countries like Moldova or Ukraine, and countries on northern Africa, Tunisia, Egypt.
Do you have a sense as to whether or not the composition of the inflow changed when
So it's a bit harder to characterize, indeed. So in the model I can actually account for unobserved characteristics like that.
Just observe stuff like, I don't know, maybe now that there's this free movement and people come with their own families,
Right.
older people.
So I could look at the singles, for instance. I mean, I know who's married or not, so I could look at that. So I'm going to normalize everything by the population of singles anyway, very quickly. Okay. Which is a good point. In essentially, the marriage rate here is just number of marriages over the population. I'm going to argue, and others done that before me, that that's not necessarily a very interesting statistics. First, because, as you can see here, the population of Romanians essentially grew very quickly at that point. So the fact that this line here is pointing upward is maybe just a scale effect. It's just a larger pool of singles. So you probably want to normalize by the number of singles. Okay. So that's what I'm going to do in these things in this slide here. So one way to normalize that is to divide by a measure of the singles. So what I'm just borrowing here from the paper by Xu and Xiao. They give this formula structural interpretation, okay, out of essentially a logistic mole. They call that the gain. I'm going to develop another mole later on, so I don't want to have two moles in that paper. So to me, it's just a statistic. So I'm going to just scale the number of marriages by the number of single men of type X and women of type Y, and take the log of it. Okay? So if you do that, you can see that essentially the gains or the normalized marriage rates here were pretty flat, so they were moving at the same speed as the single pools was expanding, and there was a clear break and decrease once the Poles learned about the entry in the EU, and the same thing for the Romanian and Bulgarian. Okay, and actually here you could see it's further declining and not increasing. Okay. So whatever you do, whether you normalize or not this number of marriages, essentially you see that this is this sharp change in marriage rates. Yeah. So here I haven't done anything, it's just pure rates, okay? I can do more stuff with regressions, where I can control the stuff. Not here though, here I'm just going to regress the gains on a dummy for being national of Poland or Romania and interacted with the post period. I'm going to throw in time dummies, province dummies, fixed effects, and nationality fixed effects, and interactions of those as well. And not very surprisingly, given the magnitude of the changes you see in the graph, this is going to come out positive, and, or not positive, but significant. Okay? Which means, so that's the interaction terms here. So whatever you do, essentially, in whatever controls you throw in, even if you interact province and year fixed effects or province nationality fixed effects, etc., it's very, very stable. Okay, so that means just that this normalized measure of marriages went down at that period, for that period. Okay. If you do the interaction year by year, you get this graph here. So this is for the Poles, where you see it's clearly going down here during that period. And for the Romanians, it went up first, while it was decreasing for the Poles, and then a sharp decline. Okay? This is for Italian husbands, and this is for the wives. So just to look at the robustness of that, so we did many things. One is, we had to take a guess on the illegal migrants from surveys. Does that matter? Essentially, not so. So we still find effects there. I always get questions about internet brides. Yes. so availability, singles, you mean? Yeah. So that's essentially what this measure is about, okay? Because we normalize by the pool of singles, right? So internet brides, so that exists. Now, we did two things. One was to look at internet diffusion, which has been rolled out in Italy at a different speed in different provinces, okay? And it doesn't seem to be to play any role there. If you think that goes through the internet. The other thing you could show, I don't have it in this slide here, is that intermarriages are strongly related to the local community. So if you have a lot of Poles in one province, then you're going to see a lot of marriage with Poles. It's not that there's a lot of marriage with Poles in areas where there's no Poles. Okay. So it's not that they import them from the country, it looks like. Okay. Now, are those fake marriages? So that was your questions. So, two things. So how do I click on this? I don't have time? Yes, sure. Whoops. Right, so essentially, if you include cohabitation, these results don't change. So once you interact the post effect on those who were affected, you see that there was a sharp decline in marriage or cohabitation. So why do I show this? Well, you could think that Italians and foreigners just like to live together. Before they were marrying because that gave them access, but now that they have access, they still live together, okay? Because they just like each other. And this is not the case. So even if you take into account those who cohabit, there was a sharp decline. Okay? So they're just not together anymore. Okay? So there's no more couples or much fewer couples, married or not, between Italians and those nationalities. Okay?
Although you would not expect an effect of sort of more permanent cohabitation. I mean, previously before the policy change, you lived together for like 20 years and didn't get married. It's probably something close to true love.
Right.
You wouldn't expect that this policy change. This would be like a placebo group almost. So I'm not sure if you could slice once more by just a short-term habitating without getting married versus like, we just be living together forever. We still do after the policy change.
So I didn't bring this graph with me. Oh, no, maybe. I click on one of the other things. So this is a Kaplan-Meier survival of marriages. The green line here being the Italians. Okay, so from the time of marriage, which is 0. And the blue and red lines are essentially, red would be the Poles and blue the Romanians. So you can see that essentially they're not exactly fake marriages. After a few years, only a few % of those matches have actually dissolved. Okay, so those who marry, actually, these marriages, especially if you scale that, which I did here in this graph with US marriages, they are way, way stable than the average US marriage. Okay? So it's not that they, so remember that actually once they got married for 2 years, they can actually get access, citizenship. Okay? So it doesn't look like they're just fleeing this marriage as fast as they can. So they are surprisingly stable. Okay? For various reasons, maybe they have children at some point, and maybe it's true love, etc. But or love actually matters more than we think. But they're actually quite stable. Okay. Yeah.
It might be just culture. What does it say that Americans systematically love each other less than people?
No, I'm just pointing out, I'm just giving you some perspective on marriage stability. I have nothing to say about marriage in the US. Now, if you look at, so that's one aspect. Now, if you look at divorces, We look at couples that actually married a few years before the enlargement. So they married, but they didn't know that the country was about to enter the EU. Actually, you can see a peak of separations once the enlargement took place. Okay, so I have a table, a bit messy, but which shows you that. In just the year so for the Poles, it was in 2004. You can see a peak of separation around that date. It's pretty short-lived, but there's a significant divorce rate there. And the same for the Romanians. Okay? What's true as well is that if you look at marriages that was formed before and marriages that was formed after the reform, well, the marriages that formed after the reform are much more stable than the one before. Okay? So before, that tells you that probably they were, in the trade-off, they were marrying also for legal status before. After that, there's no need for that. So those who actually get married are much stronger marriages. Okay, so first I would just like to, so this is a bit like Andrew's paper here. So if you look at age at marriage, the difference between husbands and wives. So the blue here is the husband's age at marriage, and the red here are wives, the age of the wives. Okay, so here's 28, 32. So these are couples where they're both Italians. Okay, so typically an Italian marriage would have a wife on average who's about 28, and a man who is about 31 or so. Okay, so about 3 years difference. Okay. So this is an Italian husband. So Italian husbands marrying wives from the OECD countries, so fairly developed countries, you see pretty much the same pattern in terms of age difference. Now, when you move more to the right, you get areas or countries which have a lower GDP per capita. And you can see that the types of marriages here are changing quite dramatically. It's not so much that the wife's age is that much different. She's always about 28 or 30, but it's the man who is a bit weird. Okay? So the man's age tends to go up quite a lot. Okay? So who are these Italian men marrying these foreign women? Essentially elderly men. Okay? And so much more if they're coming from kind of poorer areas, right? Now, if you look at Italian wives, it's a bit less mixed, or it's more mixed here, but here's the same points, essentially, so they're both Italians. So this is Italian women marrying Italian man, this is Italian women marrying a man from the OECD. So it's pretty much the same when you go from OECD to the old Europe countries. But once you move on the right here, you get sometimes essentially wives here marrying actually younger men, okay, which you don't see that much in Italy. So even on the women's side, although there are fewer marriages, it's kind of weird or unusual patterns, let's put it like that. If you look at the years of education, here Italian husbands, in Italy the husbands are on average a bit less educated than the wives. Okay? And when you move to the right, you can see that the blue dots are going down, which means that those are actually low-educated Italians marrying foreign wives, which are much more educated than themselves. Okay? So the type of people who marry these foreigners are essentially elderly men and low-educated men, going from much younger women and more educated women. Okay? So it seems that there's a trade-off, that these women here are giving up some form of surplus in the sense that they accept men who are older and less educated in exchange for something else, which in our case here would be legal status. Okay? So we have here a trade-off, and the men, well, they gain characteristics that are desirable on the marriage market that they wouldn't get otherwise. Okay? Now you can wonder where maybe those nationalities here, it's just that those women are just marrying typically in their own country men which are much older. Okay? if you look at homogeneous marriages, so when these people marry, so if you take Asians in Italy marrying other Asians, you can see the age gap is remarkably constant. Okay? So it's not that this population has a preference towards older men. It's just that when they're marrying outside of their own community, they go for different men. Okay, so how much time do I have? Like 5 minutes. 12 minutes, yeah. Okay, so far it's just been reduced form. So maybe it's time to put a bit of a structure on here. So we're going to have, so what I'm aiming for is not that much. It's a simple model that would rationalize this pattern in the data and that I can estimate in a reasonable amount of time, and that would essentially allows me to identify deeper parameters of the marriage surplus. Okay? So I want to have these trade-offs between ethnic or cultural distance, legal access to work, and differences in age and education and possibly wealth. Okay? So the way I'm going to, so what I can do with this model then is I can evaluate the effect of the EU enlargement. So in terms of surplus and how that changed the surplus within that economy. So the EU enlargement was not exactly meant to change the surplus or the marriage surplus. So this is an indirect effect of those policies. And what I'm interested in here is looking at counterfactual events, which are not necessarily meant as policies towards marriage, but which takes place. So one which was popular in Italy for a while was amnesties. So declaring that anyone who is illegal have now the right to work. We give you papers. And the second part is essentially what is going on in Italy right now is the surge of migration and how that changes marriage patterns. Okay.
Do the large differences in age or education between Italian husband and foreign wife translate into also larger differences in Italian husband and Italian wife, like through gender equity? Now that these Italian men have these outside functions?
Yes, so essentially part of the older Italian men, when they couldn't get Poles and Romanians, so they went to, as I say, to Moldavian and Ukrainians, but they also went back on the domestic market. Okay, so there was a slight gain for older women, for Italian women as well. Okay, so those would have suddenly they had a market, okay, instead of staying single. So the way I'm going to place that is a very simple model of transferable utility. So I'm going to have the utility of a match, which I call phi, which depends on the characteristics of the men and the women. I'm not going to specify what goes on within that couple, so they're just going to share that surplus in some way. And so I can't say much with the data I have about how, or I can't say anything about how this is shared. Essentially, I don't have consumption data or anything like that. And there's going to be limited search where each individual would look at n potential matches and then choose. Okay? There's going to be two separate periods, so before and after the enlargement. So t equal 1 and 2, that's why I indexed phi here. So in terms of characteristics, I'm going to look at 4 characteristics. So they have a vector for men and women. So age, education, ethnicity, or which part of your world are you coming from, and wealth, whether you have housing or not. And this is the 8 groups of countries where you could be from. Okay. The surplus is going to be written in this way. So it's going to be parametric. And first there's love, okay, which is epsilon. So this is the surplus that Mr. I would have meeting Mrs. J. Okay, so there's a couple-specific love component, which is unusual in that part of the literature. I get to that later. Then there's something which is going to be involving age, education, ethnicity, and wealth. which is going to say how people value or how surpluses value is changing with these characteristics. And then I have the only thing which is actually indexed with T here in this line is related to legal status. Okay? So beta is going to be 1 if you have access to work, and it's going to be less than 1, so you have a penalty if you do not have access to legal status. Okay? So for instance, if I'm Romanian, and if I'm marrying another Romanian, a Romanian wife, then we have to pay a penalty in the first period because we don't have access to the legal work in Italy. If I am marrying an Italian woman, then I would have a beta equal to 1. Okay? And that changes with the policy. And this omega here is just the value of remaining single. Okay? So, so this beta here is going to change. This slide is just talking about that. I'm also going to talk about divorce, and divorce here is going to be very, very simple. The surplus of marriage is just going to erode with time. And so if you started off with a surplus phi t, then you have less of that later on. Okay? So you divorce only, being divorced means you were married in the first place, so your surplus was positive, and then becomes negative after k years. Okay? Now, there's an apparatus here to make sure you compute the equilibrium. Essentially, on the transferable utility, what I'm going to find the optimal allocation, you're maximizing the sum of the surpluses here under some constraint, which essentially just says that you can only be either married or divorced, and that should add up to the number of females in the economy, number of males in the economy, and some constraint that says that you can only be married or divorced. Okay, so that's pretty standard in that literature. Now the estimation is going to be essentially done by simulation. The reason is that with this specification, this is a kind of an unusual specification here. It's very far from the Tua model. First, because the functional form are different, and second, because here I have a couple specific love components. Okay, so that means that there's no simple functional form that I can rely on, which was nice and elegant in Shu and Xiao. The only problem is essentially Shu and Xiao is a multinomial logit, which has the IIA problem, and here I have essentially a good, which is the Romanians or the Poles on the market, which is changing over time. So I have a new good arriving. Okay, so that's not a good situation for a multinomial logit in general. Okay, so this specification here is different and does not have that restriction. It's also, so me being new in this literature, I thought maybe naively that there was some kind of specific couple love component in there. Okay, so that's why I wrote that in the first place. So given that, there's no functional form, simple functional form solution. So what I do, I'm going to simulate that. And I'm going to compare the marriage rate predicted from the model with the one I observe. And I'm also going to match on an OLS coefficient of a regression of whether you divorce or not, given when you learn about your country entering the EU. Okay, so essentially some of the stuff I showed you before. Okay, so you're going to have the one in the data and the one from the model. I'm going to minimize the distance here, weighted in different ways, and which is here the marriage markets part, and here the divorce part. Okay. Now, how do I simulate that? Well, I'm going to take each province, and each province will have ex ante distribution of singles with different characteristics, okay, in terms of age, in terms of education, in terms of nationalities, and so on. So I'm going to draw from that province-specific distribution. So I'm relying not only on the time difference, on which is shifting the policy, but also on local differences in terms of the pool of singles. Okay, so I'm drawing from that distribution, and then I'm going to solve the optimal matching. I'm going to take S markets with n men and women, and they're going to essentially look at each other and decide who's going to marry with whom. Okay, and this is done with a linear solver, Groby for those who know that, who's going to do the optimal allocation. And then we're going to record anyone as married, those who have positive surplus in the economy. Okay, and that's essentially the estimation. So in the 1 minute I have, I can show you a bunch of graphs, which is essentially the fit of the mole. I'm going to skip that. This is how the surplus associated with age, essentially. So if you fix, say, a man of age 37, the surplus would peak essentially for women of age a bit younger, 34. Okay, so couples have higher surplus if the woman is slightly lower age. And you see that those marriages here, they may form, but at least from the age component, they're not very well matched. So something else is probably stepping in, love or education, something else, okay? Interestingly, so if you're a man of age 50, it's much flatter, okay? So you prefer a wife who is probably a bit younger than you, but a wife who is 25 is not that far away, okay? I'm going to skip that. We also have a matrix of surpluses by nationality. So that's the component of which I've normalized here by 1 your own type. And you can see the distance between two nationalities. Okay? So some nationalities are kind of better match, like Italians and New EU. But if you look here, Africans with Poles, that doesn't mix that well. Okay, so they've got a very low surplus. So what does this number means? Well, essentially it's if you can see, it's by revealed preferences that comes essentially identifies these parameters, is how people matches on these marriage markets and how that change with the policy. So that's how these coefficients are identified.
This is not because geographic heterogeneity, because different immigrants are in different regions, no? This is after control for that.
Yeah, yeah.
Net of the immigration benefit.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Now, if you project that on measures that people have used in terms of distance across people, like genetic distance, sure, it is correlated. The R-square is 0.5, but only so much. Okay, so it captures something else, which is what these guys are choosing as partners. But it seems that genetic distance is only part of the story. Oh, I had also another slide with language distance, which is actually doing even a poor job. Okay. So what is going on? Do you have 1 minute? By now, I can have as much as I want. I'm over time anyway, so. So if I show you here a combination of cultural distance and legal access. So after the accession, and this is from the point of view of women from Poland and Romania, okay? So after the accession, these are the yellow bars. Essentially, they prefer people from their own country. Okay? That's the highest surplus. Okay? Next would be Italians, because they're not culturally too distant. The people from EU, etc., all the way down to Asia and Africa. Okay? So that's, in the absence of legal status, that's what their ordering of preferences. Now, the blue bar is before accession and takes into account the penalty for not having access to legal work. You can see that the preferences or the surpluses are just reversed here. Okay? So now what's best here, or the best couples, are actually those formed by these Romanians and Italians. And that's better than Romanians with Romanians, because then they would not have access to legal access to Italy. Okay? And that would make any other match worse here, because marrying an African is no good for them. Okay? I'm just going to conclude here. Okay? So essentially, I'm exploiting here a very stark variation in data, and that buys me a lot in terms of identification, because it's very straightforward where it comes from. And clearly, on one side, from the foreigners' side, you could see that they value legal access. Their marriage choices clearly distorted before. And on the native side, which is interesting, is you have a succession of changes in the pool of singles they face, and you can see how they re-optimize. Okay? So that's a chance, or a unique chance, to essentially identify separately both the value of legal status in a country and essentially affinities by culture. Okay? Now, if I had time to talk about the welfare stuff, essentially it's a transfer from away from natives to those migrants, and more likely from older native men towards these younger and foreign people. But there's a lot of heterogeneity. Yeah, I'm done. Thanks.